chat. Sorry. And then if you have any questions, also feel free to raise your hand. Also, please mute yourself when you're not speaking. And then at the end of the presentation, we're going to be passing out a link to the evaluation. It's only going to take a couple minutes, but please, if you can just fill it out. And then lastly, we are going to be taking like screenshots, pictures throughout the training, and this is just for us. If you don't feel comfortable, feel free to turn off your cameras. We're gonna be recording this webinar. So just as like a reminder. And so the objectives of this training is participants will be able to have a better understanding of what vaping and what e-cigarettes are. Participants will be able to identify 2 health risks associated with using e-cigarettes. And lastly, participants will be able to identify 2 potential signs that a teen is vaping. And so before we begin with the actual webinar, we do have a really quick reflection activity before we begin. So please take a couple of seconds and write your answers in the chat. You can also raise your hand if you want to share aloud. But the question for the reflection activity is, how does tobacco and e-cigarette consumption impact our communities? And then again, please take a couple seconds to think about this. And once you have your answer, you can put it in the chat. Okay, does anybody want to like share? Like, how do you think tobacco and e-cigarette consumption impact our communities? There's no wrong answer here. So we're just trying, to start some conversation. Okay, here I see one of the comments that it says it affects everyone's health. Yeah. Anything else?
I know we've got a lot of folks that are coming from different paths of public health, so I'm curious to see what y'all's opinion are on how tobacco affects everyone.
Here in the chat, I see that it affects the environment, widens health disparities, especially in marginalized communities. One more, or okay. Here, somebody also put pollution. Yes. These are really great examples here. I also see leads to increases in cancer, lung. It also increases hospitalization rates in vulnerable communities. Your lungs do not function well. Yes. So we're gonna be like, these are really good responses, and we are gonna be talking a little bit more about it throughout the webinar. Thank you for participating.
Thank you all for your responses. I'm glad that I see some of the responses that you all put are going to tie into some of the things we'll be talking about later on. So that's going to segue us into our first module. For the first module, we're really going to be talking about and giving almost like a working definition of what is electronic cigarettes, what's vaping, the content inside of these e-cigarettes, as well as also touch a little bit on the marketing aspect towards these e-cigarettes. But to start us off, we'll go ahead and talk about the anatomy of an e-cigarette. And just so, again, we're all on the same page, e-cigarettes are battery-operated devices. So here's the battery that heat up the liquid in this clear tank. And when that liquid is heated up, it's going to produce an aerosol that we then inhale and we consume. Now, the liquid that's in here is going to vary. The look of it is going to vary depending on what type of e-cigarette you use. Before we get started, e-liquid, the liquid that's in these e-cigarettes, usually contain nicotine. Some, depending on the type of e-cigarette you use, it might not contain nicotine, or it'll also contain marijuana. But it's always also going to include some form of chemical and some form of artificial flavoring. So you'll notice that there's 3 different types of liquids that you could choose from. It all really just depends on the type of e-cigarette that you're inhaling and that you're consuming. Depending on the type of e-cigarette you have, the liquid is something that you yourself can manually refill, which is why you have some liquid that's going to come in a bottle. You're also going to have liquid that comes in a pod, something shaped like this, not too big. It's about yay big, or a cartridge, they're also known as. Or it's going to be a liquid that's already inside of the electronic cigarette. And these are typically disposable electronic cigarettes. So the liquid's already in there. Once the liquid is done, you just chuck it, you throw it out. Now, in addition to these, in addition to the liquid that's in the cigarettes, there's also other forms of chemicals that are found in there. So like I mentioned earlier, your e-cigarette's either going to have nicotine. It might not have nicotine as well. It might have marijuana, cannabis, weed, whatever you want to call it. And it's always going to have some form of flavoring, chemicals, and like we mentioned, because the liquid's going to get heated up, it's going to produce a type of aerosol. And we're going to discuss these in depth as we go on in the presentation. One vocab word that I really want us to stress and differentiate between, it involves aerosol, and it involves vapor and aerosol. I'm sure you've all heard that when you're using an e-cigarette, it's also known as vaping, or just saying that you're vaping. It's a little bit of a misconception, because you're not necessarily inhaling vapor, which in vapor, depending on what kind of liquid it is, it's not that risky, not that dangerous, right? If it's just water, you're just inhaling evaporated. It's a liquid that gets evaporated into thin air. Even though we're vaping, we're using an e-cigarette, you're not inhaling vapor. What you're actually inhaling is aerosol. Now, aerosol, just think of like in the picture with hairspray. Aerosol has tiny little particles that are going to contain the flavoring, the chemicals, the nicotine or the weed in it. And these tiny particles is what we're going to be inhaling, what we're going to be consuming, and what's going to get stuck in our lungs and in our body. So I do just want to preface that before we continue on. Although using an e-cigarette is known as vaping, you're not inhaling vapor, you're inhaling aerosol, which is more dangerous. Now, in this aerosol, sorry about that, I don't know why it keeps glitching when I switch slides. In this aerosol, you have a bunch of different chemicals. I'll leave this slide up for a moment so that you're able to see the different types of chemicals that are found. In addition to the flavoring, in addition to the nicotine or the marijuana, this is what you're also inhaling. And I'd like to highlight 4 of these chemicals, just so that we're all aware that this is what we're inhaling when we use e-cigarettes. Benzene is a common chemical that's also found in that, which we typically see in paint, we see in pesticides. We've also got acetone. So for my folks that like getting nails or having pretty nails, that strong alcohol scent that we experience when we're trying to take our nails off, we're also consuming that, which is the acetone. We also consume formaldehyde, which is typically known to be used for embalming. And lastly, propylene glycol, which is typically found in antifreeze. All of these chemicals have, in one way or another, have been linked to cancers, not just lung cancer, but all different types of cancers, lung diseases, as well as harming your reproductive organs. So there's a lot that these chemicals do. In addition to the chemicals, the e-cigarette's also going to have a lot of different types of flavor options and some form of flavoring in the e-cigarette. Now, the flavorings work in a multitude of different ways. At the most basic, the flavorings are used to hide the taste of nicotine. So, right, make it taste better, which means that you're more likely to consume that e-cigarette or use this e-cigarette. It's also used to hide the smell of marijuana if you use a marijuana pen. But I want you to take a look at the icons and the different types of flavorings that are included. These flavorings are typically fruity, they're sweet, like candies or like cakes. And this is, again, it's to hide the taste of nicotine, hide the smell of marijuana, but it can also be used for a more insidious factor of trying to entice kids, teens, young adults to use their products and potentially be hooked on that. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the slide. Now, switching gears a little bit, just again to familiarize ourselves with some of the terminology, when we use e-cigarettes, you can say that you're vaping. Like I mentioned earlier, that's why I wanted to differentiate between what is vapor and what's aerosol. But so when we're using e-cigarettes, that's known as vaping. It can also be known as juuling, and most commonly, it can also be known as smoking. I do just want to point out that vaping and juuling is exclusively just used for when you're smoking an e-cigarette, whereas smoking can be a little bit ambiguous. It can either mean you're smoking traditional cigarettes or that you're using an e-cig. And we're going to be using these words interchangeably throughout their presentation. So if we say, somebody's vaping, we're just meaning that somebody's smoking. Similar to that, there's different types of names for e-cigarettes. This can be e-cigs, vapes, pens, or vape pens. And again, Esme and I are going to be using these words interchangeably from here on out into the presentation. So if we use pens, vape pens, or vapes, we're referring to e-cigarettes. Now, there's a lot of different names for this. And just like there's a lot of different names, there's also a lot of different types of pens, types of vape pens. And as you'll notice, these are different generations across the years of pens that have been released. You'll notice that the first generation, a lot of these e-cigs were meant to look like traditional cigarettes. So if somebody was smoking, you would more or less know what it was that they were doing because they were smoking something that looked like a cigarette. But as we progress and we go through different generations, you start seeing that they look almost more like everyday household objects, right? These vape pens look like regular pens. Mods and tanks kind of look like rechargeable batteries. And these pod systems, at least this one, it kind of looks like it's a mouse, like a computer mouse. So you'll notice that all of these, as we progress with the generations, not only do they look like they're everyday household objects, but they also kind of look like they're easier to use and just easier to hide, which again can be a little bit tricky, especially if we're looking at teen usage and young adult usage. Now, before I move on to the next slide, I do just want to ask a quick question to the audience, and I'm looking for at least 2 responses in the chat. But here's a question for you all. What do you think? Let's look at these pens. Do we think that these vape pens contain more nicotine than traditional cigarettes? Do we think they contain the same amount of nicotine, or do we think they contain less amount of nicotine as traditional cigarettes? More. Oh, perfect. Oh, I asked for 2. I got 3. I love that. Oh, and you guys all wrote the right answer. I don't even need to be giving this presentation. But just like what you all mentioned, these pens actually have more. And I know somebody mentioned that they look like more, but they might contain less. That's correct. They look like they won't contain as much, but in actuality, they really do. So just to have a quick comparison point, 1 pack of cigarettes has the same amount of nicotine as 20 cigarettes. 1 Juul pod, so one of these little things, contains the same amount of nicotine as 41 cigarettes. So that's 2 cigarette packets. A puff bar, this bad boy over here, contains the same amount of nicotine as 50 cigarettes. So that's 2.5 packs worth of cigarettes. So one of our hopes and intentions throughout this presentation is, I know when e-cigarettes first came out on the market, they were always marketed as something that was healthier, a better alternative to traditional cigarette smoking. But what we hope throughout this presentation that you'll notice is it's really not healthier or a better alternative to traditional cigarette smoking. It's got as much nicotine, if not more, than traditional smokes. And it's also got just the same amount of chemicals as traditional cigarettes. Now, we'll have a quick little activity. In the next slide, what we're going to do is we're going to show you a bunch of different objects. They're all numbered. So what I want you to do is get out your magnifying glass, put on your detective hat, and I want you to look for the e-cigarettes, the pens, the vapes that we've got hidden in this. And I want you to put those numbers in the chat box so that we know that you found them. And I'll give you a couple moments for that. All right, so which ones do we think are the e-cigarettes? And let's see, there's about 4 or 5 in here, so I'm expecting 4 or 5 responses in the chat box. Oh, I see them coming in. Let me see. Let's see. Okay, I'll give a couple more moments just to see. Okay. All right, so I know we've got the right answers in there. I see people are still writing them in, so I'll give one more moment.
It seems like a lot of people are saying 2, 12, 4,
Okay.
5.
Okay, so let's go ahead and see. Let's reveal what these answers are. So we've got 2, we've got 11, 5, 8, and 9. So you can go ahead and check to see if you answer them correctly. But again, really the big point of this activity was just to show you all how easily hideable and how common, how these e-cigarettes look like everyday household objects. So it's something that if you do have a teen, if you do have a younger child in your household, just something to be on the lookout for, because they look like anything they can hide in their backpack or just like a new piece of technology. So thank you all for writing that in the chat.
Thank you, Andrea, for that. And so now we're going to be talking very briefly about advertisement around e-cigarettes and tobacco products in general. So a lot of the advertisement is aimed specifically for youth, for younger people. And as you can see on the screen, oftentimes they tend to use very bright, colorful advertisements, right? And they also tend to, like mentioned earlier, a lot of the e-cigarettes nowadays come in different shape and forms, and they do that on purpose to entice younger folks to use e-cigarettes. And so a lot of the tobacco companies, they know that if they can get somebody at a younger age, they're going to continue to use as adults, and they will eventually transition into using traditional cigarettes. And so here on the screen, can you go back, Andrea? Yeah, thank you. So here are just like a few examples of some of the ads that they're using right now, especially since, social media is a big thing. Oftentimes they tend to be targeted towards younger folks. So here, again, we can see that they're using very bright colors. They're using sweets, candy. And again, that tactic is to aim at younger folks. As mentioned earlier, there's like thousands of flavors, right? And so that's done on purpose to specifically target younger individuals. And so although the legal age to purchase tobacco products has increased to 21, and I will talk about this later on in the presentation, but very briefly, although the age has increased to 21, youth still has access to e-cigarettes. And one of the ways that they can get that is through other friends, relatives, neighbors, right? And then another way is through smoke shops as well, retail stores, online stores. But a new method that has increased is through social media, through TikTok and Instagram. Those of us that have that, whenever we're there, we're constantly getting ads to purchase things, right? And so that's like a new method that a lot of younger folks are using. And so tobacco product companies are also doing that nowadays. They're using TikTok and Instagram to advertise your products. And so a lot of younger folks are purchasing them through this route. And so I do want to mention that that can be a little bit more dangerous rather than purchasing at a retail store, for example, because there's no way, or it's just harder for us to track what's being purchased. It's harder to regulate the products. Like, we don't know what's being added into those to this e-cigarettes. We don't know if what other chemicals or what other drugs are being added, right? And so that's like another big thing right now that is happening, that it's impacting a lot of younger folks. And so in addition to targeting younger folks, tobacco companies are also targeting like low income, Black and Brown communities. And so that's like, they're doing a lot of tailored advertisement. And so there tends to be a lot more tobacco stores in low income Black and Brown communities compared to white, richer communities. And that's done on purpose to specifically target those communities. And so right now we're gonna do like a very quick activity where we're gonna be comparing two communities, two neighborhoods in Southern California. We're gonna be comparing Beverly Hills and South Central. And so as we can see, Beverly Hills, what's marked in yellow, there's not a lot of smoke shops in that neighborhood. And we can see in South Central, there's a lot more like more smoke shops there, and that's done on purpose. And so this, again, like tobacco product companies are purposely adding more stores and advertisements in those communities to target Black, Brown communities, and also students, younger folks living in those areas. And so now we're going to be transitioning into module 2, where we're going to be talking more about like vaping among youth. Thank you. And so in the United States in 2020, more than 3.6 million youth reported using e-cigarettes. And this is a relatively high number of students using e-cigarettes. And so in this graph right here, we can see that in blue, what the use of traditional e-cigarettes, while it has remained low and has decreased throughout the years, we do see that the use of e-cigarette use, what's in pink, has increased rapidly throughout the years. We do see like a slight decline in 2020, and there isn't really like, we don't know specifically why that happened, but people are speculating that it's because the legal age to purchase tobacco e-cigarettes increased to 21. And so here among middle school students, we see a very similar trend as well. We see that while the use of e-cigarettes have decreased and has remained low throughout the years, we see an increase in e-cigarette use. And so this is very alarming because a lot of middle school students are typically there are like 11 to 14 years of age. And that's like a very young age for them to start using, to start vaping. And so in the United States, 1 in 5 high school students and 1 in 20 middle school students reported using e-cigarettes. And then more specifically here in LA County, 1 in 10 high school students and 1 in 25 middle school students reported also using e-cigarettes. In that same study, 1 out of 3 7th graders and 1 out of 5 11th graders reported using e-cigarettes, or stated that using e-cigarettes is not harmful. And so we decided to add this here because it just shows the importance of having this sort of conversations and webinars and presentations to really inform parents, caregivers, public health professionals, and students about the impact that using e-cigarettes have. Okay, and so now we're going to be talking a little bit more about the policies and legislations put in place that aims to reduce e-cigarette use among youth. And so to begin with, the federal legislation, as I mentioned earlier, the legal age to purchase tobacco products increased from 18 to 21 in 2019. And there was also like a federal ban that prohibited the sale or that prohibits the sale of flavored products except for the disposable and menthol flavors. So those two products are still allowed to are still allowed. And then also the FDA announced that it wants to ban menthol flavored cigarettes and cigars. This still hasn't been approved or it hasn't passed. However, it will have really big implications considering that menthol makes it easier to smoke. And so here in California, there was like a statewide ban on most flavored tobacco products, including flavored e-cigarettes and menthol products. And this ban went into effect earlier this year. And I do want to highlight that this ban wouldn't, it doesn't punish or criminalize anybody for purchasing, for using, or for having on their possession tobacco products. This is more towards geared towards retail stores and employees selling those products. And then similar here, more like in LA City, a similar ban was passed earlier this year. And so if you live in LA City, then this would apply to you as well. I know I briefly mentioned or talked to the policies, but is there any questions so far about any of the topics that we mentioned? And you can also leave your questions in the chat throughout the webinar, and we will get to them at the end. Thank you.
Okay, so I didn't see any questions in the chat. No one mentioned anything. So we're going to shift gears a little bit more towards the health risks of e-cigarette usage. And like we mentioned earlier, we do want to stress that just because you're using an e-cigarette, you're not necessarily switching into a healthier or a better alternative than traditional cigarettes. Now, to start us off for the health risks, I do want us to talk a little bit about the addiction cycle of nicotine. It's going to be a very simple and basic explanation. I say simple and basic because we're not going to go into the nuances or the barriers and the challenges that people face when they're actually going through that addiction cycle. But this is just a brief overview just so that we're all familiar with that. So I have my handy dandy little pen here that I'm going to use as a makeshift vape pen. But to go over the addiction cycle, what happens is you take a hit from your pen, from your vape, from your e-cigarette. The nicotine that you consume that's in the aerosol, right? Aerosol, not vapor, is going to make its way to your brain. Once it gets to the brain, it's going to signal to your brain, almost like tricking them in a way, that you're feeling good. So we're going to go ahead and release this neurotransmitter called dopamine. Now, dopamine is also known as the feel-good drug. And so when your brain releases nicotine, you're going to have feelings of relaxation, feeling calm, feeling pleasure, overall, just good feelings, right? And so we're smoking. We've got more nicotine going in and everything's good up until you stop smoking and all the nicotine and the dopamine levels are going to start dropping. So when they start dropping, because you were feeling so good, because you were in such a pleasurable state, your brain's going to want more. It's going to want to keep feeling good. And if you're not smoking, if you don't take another hit from your pen, you're going to start experiencing these withdrawal symptoms. Now, they might not be too bad or intolerable at first, but the more and more we smoke, the more our tolerance increases, then the harsher and more unbearable these withdrawal symptoms can be, because you can start having massive headaches, shakiness, irritability, overall just groggy, bad feeling. And so what do we do when we're feeling bad? we're going to want to smoke some more. And so this continued cycle of smoking, smoking, smoking until we feel good. And then once we start feeling bad again because we're not smoking, that's what's going to start increasing our tolerance and just have us continue being on that addiction cycle. Now, we already mentioned that nicotine hits your brain and that releases your feel-good drug, the dopamine neurotransmitter. But what else does it do to the brain? For this slide, I want to highlight that this slide is particularly more important for our young adults, our teens, our children that are smoking cigarettes, or that are smoking e-cigarettes, or that are vaping, mainly because our brain doesn't fully develop until we're 25 years old. So if you remember, Esme earlier was saying that we've got kids as young as 11 smoking. So if they're 11, if they're 12, if they're 15, if they're 18, up until they get turned 25, your brain's not fully developed. And so what happens is when you consume nicotine, it's going to affect your attention span. It's going to mess up your learning. It's going to mess up your memory, have less or not as good memory as you had before. It's going to increase your anxiety, mess up your mood. You might feel like you're experiencing more mood swings. And lastly, it's also going to mess up your impulse control. And the reason why all of this affects younger adults, teens, children more than adults, than you or me, it's because their brain hasn't fully developed. So those lobes that are focused on, that are critical for attention, the lobes that are critical for memory, because the nicotine is impacting them, is damaging them, is harming them, you're going to have a young adult, a teenager, a child that might not have as strong of an attention span, might not have good impulse control, might be suffering already from anxiety and mood imbalances because of the nicotine. And also has what Esme was mentioning earlier, if we get kids hooked on nicotine, on e-cigs, on vapes when they're young, it's also going to increase their risk of future addiction, right? If you get them when you're young, you've got a lifelong customer. And unfortunately, that continues to the cycle of addiction. This is the only slide where I really wanted to drive the point that it affects children, teens, young adults more. But the following slides, it's fair game for anybody. Nicotine and aerosol is just going to affect you regardless of what age you're at. Now, nicotine also affects our heart. And the reason for this is because it increases our adrenaline, it increases our blood pressure and our heart rate. And the key factor of why it does that is because it constricts these guys, our blood vessels. So just quickly trying to explain this, when we consume nicotine, the nicotine is going to cause our blood vessels to go from being about yay big to very narrow, very small, very hard for blood to rush through. So for example, I want you to think about when you're getting on your favorite freeway and you're trying to change lanes, merge lanes from 4-lane to maybe like a 2-lane. What ends up happening is you get that bottlenose effect, right? It's going from something big, something where you have extra space, and it gets slowly narrower, narrower, narrower. When you're in traffic, when you're on the freeway, what ends up happening is you get backup, right? It's hard for you to merge in, and it's hard for you to cross that the reduced lanes. Similar to here, when we consume nicotine, the blood vessels get smaller, making it harder for blood to push through. And because it's getting hard for blood to push through, you see here on this side, we've got a lot of blood vessels here, right? We've got a lot of blood that's containing a lot of oxygen, it's containing a lot of nutrients, and it's making it harder for it to pass through. So on this side, we've got blood. Yeah, we've got some blood cells there, but we're not getting as much oxygen and as much nutrients as our body needs. So what happens? Your heart recognizes it and it goes into overdrive. It starts pumping more, which by pumping more, it's increasing your blood pressure and it's forcing more blood to make its way through this constricted blood vessel, which increases your heart rate. Over a continued use of nicotine, if you smoke, if you vape for a prolonged time, eventually your blood vessels are not going to be as big and wide as they normally would be, but they're going to be constricted like this on a regular basis. And this is what leads to heart diseases and heart problems. Moving on to the lungs, which I think most of us are familiar with this because we already know that that traditional cigarette smoking affects our lungs. But the way that aerosol impacts our lungs is all of those tiny little particles, they're making their way through their lungs and getting into all of these little nook and crannies, into all these little crevices. And it causes inflammation, it causes irritation, which can lead to coughing, wheezing. For example, if you've got asthma, this is just going to exacerbate and make your symptoms even worse. Aerosol is also going to weaken your immune system, your immune response. And as we know, your immune system is the security of your body. So it's what it protects you. So if our immune system is weakened, that makes it easier for other viruses, other bacteria to attack your lungs. So this can be anything like pneumonia, like I mentioned earlier, increasing your asthma symptoms, bronchitis, maybe even COVID, RSV. These are all things that can happen because your immune system is weakened. Now, I want for this next slide, this one is specifically just something that happens with vaping, but something that should be brought up, and it's going to be brought up. It's called EVALI, which is e-cigarette or vaping, product use associated lung injury. And so what EVALI is, it's something that happened, it's still something that can happen now, but it had its heyday. It had a lot of cases between August 2019 to February 2020. And here, what was happening is, remember, this is before COVID, so keep that in mind. What was happening is that we would have a lot of new patients going into the hospital complaining of really severe respiratory problems, so coughing, chest pain, shortness of breath, something that we're familiar with now because of COVID, but this wasn't something that was common at this time, August 2019 to February 2020. So folks were showing up with these respiratory issues. They were also showing up with gastrointestinal issues. So they had stomach pains, they had nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. They were showing up with all of these issues. And when they got to the hospital, doctors and researchers were trying to see, well, what is it that's causing this? And what happened was they noticed that of these about 3,000 people that were coming into the hospitals, something that they all had in common was that they used vapes, either a couple of days beforehand, a couple of weeks beforehand, but they all used vapes. More specifically, they were all using these e-cigarettes, pens, vapes that contained THC, so marijuana. It wasn't necessarily the marijuana, the THC that was causing these issues, but it was the vitamin E acetate that was causing all of this injury to them. Vitamin E acetate is something that can be digested. It's fine if you digest it because your body can filter it out. But if it's something that's inhaled, there's no way for your body to filter it and, break it down a little bit more. So that's why it was being so toxic and why it was damaging and harming so many people. Close to 3,000 people, where unfortunately 68 people died from EVALI. Now, something that I do want to mention that actually Esme brought up earlier is that another common note that was found that related all of these 3,000 folks to each other is that their pens that they bought, they typically bought them through social media sites. So like Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. And what Esme was telling us earlier is that if you're buying them from places where, it's not strongly regulated, like if you would at a traditional storefront, you don't know what type of chemicals you're consuming. You don't know what's actually inside of the pen that you're using. And so that's why a lot of these social media bought pens contained the vitamin E acetate, which was causing the EVALI. But again, this is something that was most commonly seen in 2019 and 2020, but still something that can happen right now. And there still are cases of this happening. Now, fortunately and unfortunately, we've got decades worth of research for traditional cigarettes. We have like maybe 6 to 7 decades worth of research on how cigarette affects you as the user, how cigarettes affect the people around you, how cigarettes affect the environment. But because e-cigarettes, vaping, pens are still relatively new, they're maybe like 13, 15 years old, we don't have the long-term information on how they affect us. So now we're going to shift gears again and head over to Esme.
Thank you. And then for the last module, we're going to be talking very briefly about what parents and caregivers can do in case their child is vaping. Okay, so the first thing that is like very important is to be able to recognize the signs, to be able to know whether or not they might be vaping. And one of those signs is like suddenly smelling a lot of the artificial fruits or sweet smells. Also seeing changes in behavior. So suddenly they want to be isolated, and also seeing like unknown items or products around the house. As we mentioned earlier, like a lot of the e-cigarettes nowadays come in different shapes and forms, and oftentimes they look like school materials, like chargers, computer mouse. And so if suddenly you're starting to see around the house that you don't recognize something, keep an eye out for that. And also like physical symptoms. So it suddenly they start coughing a lot, or they have headaches. Those are also like symptoms that they're potentially using e-cigarettes. And also it suddenly they start using or spending a lot more money than usual, and they're not able to tell you how they spent it. That's like another sign. And finally, another potential sign is mood swings. And so, as what Andrea mentioned, that's like another symptom or a risk, right? So, if suddenly your kid is, happy in one moment, but suddenly is angry, upset, that can also be an indication that they're using e-cigarettes. And I do want to note that if you notice these signs, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're vaping, but it could be a sign of having like, or a sign or indication that maybe you should have a conversation with your child about vaping. And so, as mentioned, right, like having a conversation with your child is very important. And so, if you think that they're using e-cigarettes, it's very important for you to have a conversation with them. To not to only have it once and that's it. It's important to have constant conversations with them about like using e-cigarettes, the risk associated with vaping. And I know it can be uncomfortable to have those sort of conversations. So if you're having difficulty, you can always ask for help. There's a lot of organizations that um, can help you navigate those conversations with them. And while you have those conversations with your child, it's important to build trust. It's important for you to reassure your child that you're not going to be upset or angry with them. And it's also like, important for you to be understanding. And if possible, like share personal experiences or something that can help you connect with them. And then if your child is vaping, it's important for you to help them quit. And it's important for you to stay calm, for you to focus on their health and safety rather than a punishment. And again, if you need the additional help, um, there's nothing wrong with asking for help. There's a lot of organizations, again, that can help you navigate that situation. And then also, it's very important for you to remember that quitting is a process and will take time. And so we will be sharing with you all like a resource folder that will contain resources that you can use both in English and Spanish. We're going to be sharing the slides for today's presentation, so you will have access to that as well. But we just wanted to share with you some of the resources that you're going to be receiving from Andrea and me in the next couple of days or so. And so we're going to be sharing with you all some websites that you can use. We're gonna have them in English only, or we're gonna be sharing websites that are both in English and Spanish.
Okay, so now you're all going to get a break from us talking, and now it's going to be on you to talk. What we're going to be doing for the remainder of our webinar is we're going to breaking you out into breakout groups. In a moment, we'll be doing that. Once you get assigned into your breakout groups, you should be getting a little pop-up in your screen, just saying what breakout room you'll be in. All we need you to do is just hit that join breakout room, and that'll happen in a moment. And this is our ask. What we want you to do, I know all of you are coming in from public health spaces, so I know you've got some creativity, you've got some good one-liners, so we're hoping to hear that from you. What we want you to do is we want you to come up with a 30-second, a quick little after-school special pitch. And so what this means is we want you to, almost like you're creating a commercial, where we want you to discourage young adults from vaping. Your pitch should include two things. It's going to include a catchy opening line, and it's also going to include one or two facts that were mentioned in today's presentation. You're going to be in these breakout groups for 5 minutes. And so within those 5 minutes, you'll come up with your pitch. But we also want you to designate one person to deliver the pitch to the entire group. So after those 5 minutes, we'll be coming back to this main group like we have right now. And you'll have that one person, the one designated person, to deliver that pitch to everybody. Do we have any questions so far? We'll also put these directions in the chat so that you're able to see them when you get into your breakout groups. Thank you, Nayab. Okay. So if there's no questions, we'll go ahead and put you in the breakout groups. Again, you'll be in them for 5 minutes. At 2 minutes, we'll send out like a broadcast message. And then at 1 minute, you'll have the facilitators go in and just check in, make sure everybody has if they have any questions, and just remind them that our breakout groups will be finishing shortly. Okay. So if there's no questions, we'll go ahead and start putting you into your breakout groups. Perfect. I see that some of you are already heading in there. And remember, you'll have a little pop-up on your screen that invites you to a breakout room. Just go ahead and click the blue button to join breakout room. See, I still see some folks that I haven't gone in yet. Let's see, Maria Matza, Maria Wells. If you have any questions, just let us know so that we can go ahead and put you in those breakout groups. I see we've got another user, E278409. If you have any questions getting into the breakout groups, just let us know.
I'm just going to check on both the breakout rooms. It seems like some people left, so there might be some people in individual, and then we can reassign. Just a second.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
I'm going to add the instructions in the broadcast message.
Hi, Edwina. Can you hear me? Hi, Edwina, are you there?
Yes, I was trying to unmute myself. I'm
Sorry.
driving now on my way to my next meeting. But
Oh, okay.
the person that was in, they hung up. I told them I wouldn't be able to speak out because I'll be driving.
Okay.
They hung up.
Do you want to, we can put you in the other, it looks like this is the only other room left, so we can put you in the other one and you can just listen, and then you obviously won't be expected to participate since you're driving.
Okay, yeah, put me in a group with someone so I can.
All right, great, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for letting us know.
Okay, Edwina was the only one left in there, so I'm gonna move her to room 2, and then we'll just have one group.
Okay, sounds good. So since we have just one group, maybe we can leave them in a little bit longer, just since we're adding another person to it.
Yeah, no problem. Wait, and sorry, what did Maria Wells and Maria Matza say?
Maria was just mentioning in the chat, thank you for keeping us updated, Maria, that there's interruptions at home right now. So I'm not sure if she'd be able to join the breakout group. That was
Okay.
Maria Matza. I haven't heard anything from Maria Wells.
Okay. I'm going to add her to the other room as well, just in case.
Okay, thank you.
Has anyone gone into room 2 yet?
Not yet. We were just giving a little extra more time since we had new folks joining that room. But I can go in a minute.
I can just, it wasn't for time, it was just to like check in on them, because if I haven't checked in on them, I just want to make sure everything's all right. So
Okay.
I'll go.
Oh yeah. Do you mind checking? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to check in. Sorry to interrupt if you guys are going already, but have you guys gotten started? Do you guys understand the prompt? Do you guys need me to read the prompt again?
I think we're good.
Okay, great, thanks. We'll check in with you guys, or we'll send a broadcast message when there's about a minute left. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, did we come up with a catchy phrase?
How's our group 2 doing?
They're doing all right. There's, what is it, 4 people in there, but one of them's driving, so it's really only like 3 people in there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think a lot of people just dropped off like towards the end of the meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah, as soon as we said breakout rooms, they were like, bye.
People literally broke out.
Yeah. And also, do you think we should like stop recording here, since it's just gonna be them sharing their answers and then we're gonna be passing out the evaluation link? Or you think we should still continue?
I don't think it's gonna add much for people learning, so let me stop recording, and then we can probably edit this part out later. Just cut it short.
Okay.
All right, yeah, good idea, thanks.